Are you looking for ways to strengthen your marriage? Would you like to raise children you enjoy being around? Do you long for a peaceful, orderly home that's a blessing to everyone who comes through its doors? Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jennifer Flanders, a Bible-believing, homeschooling mother to 12 and host of the Loving Life at Home podcast. Join me as we discover what God's Word has to say about marriage, motherhood, and minding the things that matter most. Hello, friend. Welcome to episode 73 of Loving Life at Home. Today, we're talking about how to help your kids stop fighting. Now, I did an episode several weeks ago about how to help siblings become better friends. I'll link that in the show notes. I think it was episode 44. But today's episode was prompted by a letter I received from a desperate mom who wrote, "Dear Jennifer, my two boys are so mean to each other. I do not know how to break this cycle. Besides, I used to misbehave myself in the past, and that has been transferred to my son. I'm pretty desperate. I should have started when they were young, but now they are too old to learn new tricks. Help." Now, she doesn't actually tell me how old her boys are, so I don't know if these are two, 6 and 7-year-olds going at it or if they are in their teens already, but my advice to her would be to not despair. Whenever there's life, there is hope. When our children are younger, consistently applying a few key tips was enough to keep the fighting to a bare minimum. They would still wrestle and roughhouse from time to time, especially the boys, as that sort of play seems to be hardened into their natures, but it was seldom done in a mean-spirited way. In any family where there are people, there are going to be occasional disagreements, but constant bickering among children can quickly drive their parents crazy. How are we to handle such conflicts and rivalry? If the kids are still relatively young, the most effective way to stop sibling squabbles can be summed up in 5 simple and alliterative ways: pray, practice, penalize, prune, and persevere. And those are the steps that I would give to anybody that's dealing, especially with younger children that are squabbling. That first one, pray. My husband and I pray daily for a peaceful home, for a loving family, for obedient children, and for God's wisdom in training them all. We do this even before problems arise. Then whenever tempers do flare, we pray individually with the children involved that God will help them to put others first and to show love to one another. We appeal to our older children especially to exercise patience and self-control, and we point them to relevant verses such as 1 John 4:20 through 21, Luke 6:31, Galatians 5:13, and Proverbs 6:16 through 19. Then practice. Once we've identified where the children erred in the way that they were relating to one another, we ask, how could you have handled this situation better? Then, especially when they're little, we have them run through the scenario again with the preferred responses. Depending on the ages of children involved, we might practice this 3 or 4 times before moving on. Okay, son, instead of snatching the toy away this time, ask, may I play too? Or, sweet girl, instead of hitting your brother and screaming when he grabs your toy, can you practice sharing? Say, would you like a turn now? Then the third point, penalize. Sometimes conflict stems from immaturity and thoughtlessness, but other times it's something else and should be dealt with accordingly. We believe that deliberate cruelty, belligerence, and name-calling should not be tolerated, never be tolerated in a family. We love our children too much to let them grow up to be bullies. Therefore, we try to put a stop to that type of behavior swiftly and decisively. Clearly defined rules and consistently enforced consequences makes life at home more enjoyable for everyone in it. Then, fourth, prune. Our rule has always been, if you can't get along with your siblings, you can't play with your friends. By thus pruning outside relationships, it allows our children to focus their attention and energy on forging friendships with their own brothers and sisters. But there are other things that get pruned whenever our kids have trouble getting along. Anything that seems to be the source of quarrels, gets taken away, at least temporarily, including any toys that they repeatedly fight over. Cutting out excess sugar can calm children down and can help them behave more civilly. And did you know that a person's level of happiness is decreased by 5% for every hour of television he watches a day? Reasoning that the same principle might hold for viewing DVDs or surfing the internet or playing video games, we cut back on our already very limited use of visual media whenever our children seem irritable and impatient with one another. And then fifth, persevere. You don't have to live with squabbling. Let your children know that you're not going to tolerate their fighting anymore, then be consistent in dealing with it swiftly. Yet the nature of sibling relationships is such that these rules will probably need to be applied repeatedly, so don't expect to run through these steps once, never to be bothered by bickering between brothers and sisters again. Every time an argument breaks out, just rinse and repeat, and they'll eventually catch on. The Bible tells us, do not grow weary in doing good, for in due time you will reap if you don't lose heart. And if you continue to apply these principles, I am certain that you will reap good results if you stay consistent. At some point, though, if kids haven't learned to get along, then the conflicts escalate. And this may be what that mom was discussing. They go from occasionally squabbling over toys to acting as if they despise one another. Even then, with lots of prayer, patience, and perseverance, I believe the situation can be turned around. The psalmist declares, "Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity." That's Psalm 133:1. Isn't that the goal of parents everywhere? Now, if you're dealing with older children, especially preteens and teens, I think you need to keep 6 additional things in mind as you tackle the problem. First of all, know that hormones make it harder. Emotions run high when kids enter puberty, and that isn't just true for girls. Anytime our family has had an issue with 2 siblings struggling to get along, either one or both of them has been in that transitional phase. I say this not to justify bad behavior, but to raise awareness of a big contributing factor. I remember when our first couple of kids started going through puberty and they were just suddenly so irritable with one another, and it did not seem as easily resolved as when they were younger. But by the time we had gone through that cycle a few times, our prior experiences assured us that this stage would get better if we just extended some grace, but also remained consistent in those principles that we had been applying all along. I recommend sitting the offenders down and explaining to them why they suddenly feel so sensitive about things that they normally wouldn't have given a second thought. Explain that they have a lot more hormones coursing through their bodies right now than they have ever had to deal with before, but that those hormones will eventually settle down as they adjust to their changing bodies. And in the meantime, they need to show one another a little grace and do their very best not to purposefully provoke each other. Then second, set a good example. I understand that the constant bickering takes a toll on even the steadiest of nerves, but you must make sure your reaction to the strife isn't compounding it. If your children are yelling and fighting and out of control, they do not need a parent yelling and cursing and out of control as well. Keep your cool and deal with the fighting in a calm and rational way. Then third, separation sometimes helps. During those hormonal phases, it might be necessary to shuffle room assignments a bit to provide a little extra buffer for the two who seem to be continually getting on one another's nerves. Sometimes older kids will boss younger ones around and treat them like slaves. Sometimes younger kids will intentionally pick at older ones just to get a rise out of them. Neither of these dynamics is healthy for either party. Giving each a little space allows both to mature beyond any antagonizing behaviors while hopefully sparing the relationship permanent damage. Then fourth, evaluate peer influences. For reasons I cannot comprehend, some kids think it's cool to treat little brothers or sisters like second-class citizens. Be sure your child is not learning bad habits from friends who are mean to their siblings or from television programming that models such behavior, including many of the programs I've seen on the Disney Channel. The rule at our house has always been, Again, if you can't get along with your family, you can't spend time with your friends at all. Granted, this is easier to enforce since we homeschool and are together all day anyway, but as much as possible, you should eliminate time spent with friends who model poor behavior in their own family relationships, even if your kids are attending private or public schools. Then fifth, monitor media use. Be aware of what your children are watching or playing or listening to, because much of what is available is violent and will promote violence. And of course, there's other awful things that they should not be getting into on the internet. And if they do, the guilty conscience that they have as a result can also contribute to irritability. But even beyond content, keep track of the time spent with electronic devices. Because as I said before, the more time a child spends staring at a screen, the more unhappy and irritable he's going to become. This is true whether the screen belongs to a computer, television set, iPad, or gaming console, and it undoubtedly contributes to family discord. Whenever our kids start having trouble getting along, we immediately restrict access to all digital media. Being dependent on one another as playmates for fun, rather than relying on video programming or digital games for entertainment, does an amazing job of fostering friendships among brothers and sisters. Then, lastly, replace bad habits with good. It will never be enough to tell your children to just stop being mean to one another. That will just create a big void that will quickly collapse if not filled with something better. The goal is not just to avoid having our kids kill one another. We want to cultivate genuine friendships between siblings. So take a listen to that episode that I linked in the show notes. And help them replace the bad with the good. Replace hateful actions with loving actions, cutting remarks with encouraging remarks, and disgusted smirks with warm smiles. We sometimes require siblings who are at odds to generate lists. 10 thoughtful things I could do for fill in the blank with whatever sibling they're not getting along with. Or 12 things I love and appreciate about blank. Again, whatever sibling that they're fighting with the most goes there. It's a practical way of applying the command in Philippians 4:8 to set our minds on things that are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. I imagine anyone who has been a parent to more than one child for any length of time has had to deal with sibling conflicts at some point. But that doesn't have to be the norm going forward. And with a little practice, patience, pruning, and lots of prayers, I'm convinced that you'll see a marked improvement in the relationships between your children, just as I have.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you have a question you'd like to hear covered on this podcast, message me on Instagram at Flanders_family or contact me through my website, lovinglifeathome.com. Before you go, if you've been encouraged by something you've heard on the show, do me a favor and forward the link to a friend or head over to Loving Life at Home on Apple iTunes to subscribe and leave a written review of the show. Your doing so will help others find me so they can listen too. Until next time, I pray the Lord will bless your efforts to build a loving home life centered on Him.